Imagine that somebody you love, someone clever, kind, and magnificently talented, is changing before your very eyes. And no matter what you do, you cannot help them. How far would you go to try to bring them back? And would you let yourself be pulled into the darkness? In the Tate Britain in London, there is a painting that's popular for its captivating beauty and strangeness. Today we're going to talk about this painting and the sinister tale of the artist behind it. I'm Heidi from the Obsession podcast, where we like to get horribly obsessed with weird things, and I might even create my own artwork on the story. Please stay tuned until the very end so I can reveal it to you. The Fairy Feller's Masterstroke by Richard Dadd shows a scene of almost maddening detail and complexity. Groups of miniature denizens of the fairy realm gather in long grass and clumps of daisies to witness the feller or woodsman attempting to split apart a chestnut, his arms and axe frozen in the moment before the heavy blow. The audience, which include Oberon and Titania, fairy ladies in fine gowns, goblins, satyrs, centaurs and gnats, are watching with amusement, and on closer inspection we can see why they're laughing. The feller's axe has no blade. The painting is charming, unearthly, and there has rarely been an anthology of fairy illustrations in which it hasn't been included. But there is a gruesome history behind the painting, and it is one of the most intriguing instances of art history converging with a true crime story. Richard Dadd was born in Chatham, Kent, the fourth of 9 children. His father, Robert, was a chemist and an enthusiastic fossil hunter. His mother, Marianne, died when Richard was 7. By this time, Richard was considered to have a prodigious talent for drawing, and his doting father did everything he could to support his gifted son. After a failed attempt at managing his own museum, Robert Dadd decided to relocate his family to London, where he started a framing and gilding business. As a young man of 20, Richard was accepted into the Royal Academy of Arts, where his charisma and vibrant personality made him the most socially influential student at the school. His particular group of friends were referred to as the clique, and they were regarded as the future leaders of the London art scene. Richard was considered by his teachers and peers to be far and away the most outstanding talent of the Academy. However, when Richard graduated, he struggled to find the sort of commissions that would bring financial security. At long last, an opportunity arrived in 1842 when the wealthy Sir Thomas Phillips decided to engage an artist to document his upcoming grand tour of Europe and the Middle East. Sir Thomas offered Richard an all-expenses-paid holiday in return for illustrations of his adventures, and Richard happily accepted. The tour was physically exhausting, but Richard discovered that he had a deep love of travelling. He was particularly enchanted by the Middle East, and he filled up his sketchbooks with scenes from Turkey, Damascus, and Jerusalem. The place that captivated him among all others was Egypt, and he was overcome with inspiration, devouring everything he could in regards to ancient archaeology and iconography. However, it was here that the first particles of darkness began to float around Richard's brain. See, the Dad family had a history of mental health problems, and Richard was painfully aware of his chances of becoming a stranger to his own mind. Richard became very gloomy during a boat trip up the Nile, and Sir Thomas and the other members of the travelling party began to fear the young man's sudden personality changes and outbursts of temper. He had also developed an unsettling obsession with the ancient Egyptian god Osiris. It was in Italy that Richard began to truly feel the threads of his sanity beginning to snap. He was overwhelmed by the Christian iconography of Rome and began to feel that he was being watched by the devil. The art galleries of Florence brought no solace to Richard's troubled mind. In fact, he began to see satanic messages in the great masterworks. He also harbored fantasies of murdering the Pope. Sir Thomas was relieved when in Paris, Richard suddenly left the party to return home alone. His arrival in London caused concern among his family and friends, but the strangeness of his demeanour was put down to sunstroke. Richard got to work transforming his travel sketches into paintings, determined to honour his agreement with Sir Thomas. Richard disappeared into his work, becoming reclusive and moody. His father, Robert, was watching his son very carefully. Some of Richard's siblings had started showing signs of hereditary mental health issues, and Robert felt overwhelmed. He consulted Dr. Alexander Sutherland, who was referred to as a mad doctor, which was the closest thing they had to a psychiatrist back then, who advised him to send his son to a hospital. Well, Robert was reluctant to do this, and instead he decided to take Richard on a short holiday. In August 1843, father and son took a steamer to Cobham, a village in Kent. On the evening of their arrival, Richard suggested that they take a walk through the park in the moonlight. What Robert didn't know was that his son was under the delusion that the ancient Egyptian god, Osiris, was his real father, and that he, Robert, was a demonic impostor. On some point during the walk, Richard struck his father on the head from behind, attempted to slit his throat with a razor, and then stabbed him with a folding knife. After leaving his father to die alone in the park, Richard ran from the scene of the crime and hoarded a pre-booked boat to France, still covered in his father's blood. His earlier purchase of a passport and ticket show that the murder had to have been premeditated. After disembarking in Calais, Richard took a stagecoach to Lyon. While on the coach, he heard a message from the stars telling him to kill a fellow passenger to appease Osiris. Richard took out his razor and turned to the man closest to him. Luckily, the other passengers restrained Richard before he could do more than wound his seatmate, and the police were summoned. Richard was arrested and taken to an asylum in Claremont. There, doctors found that he had been carrying a list of people that he planned to murder. The list included his father and the Emperor of Austria. It took 11 months for him to be extradited to London, where he would go to trial for the murder of his father, Robert Dadd. During the initial hearing, Richard's behaviour was so disordered that the judges decided not to take it to trial, as Richard was so clearly insane. Richard was declared a criminal lunatic and placed in the Bedlam Royal Hospital. Now, Bedlam, or as it is more commonly known, Bedlam, was quite a bit more progressive than other psychiatric hospitals of the Victorian era. And while it wasn't a luxury resort by any means, it wasn't the nightmare of filth and degradation often associated with asylums of that time. His brother George, who had been showing similar symptoms, joined him there soon after. While in Bedlam, Richard rediscovered his love of painting, and it was there that he produced his most known works, including the Fairy Fellas masterstroke. Richard and his fellow criminal lunatics, as they were then called, were eventually moved from Bedlam and into the brand new Broadmoor Hospital. Broadmoor now has a gruesome reputation for being home to the most notorious of serial killers, but in its early days, Broadmoor was seen as a place of higher reform in terms of healthcare and psychiatric treatment. The patients put on stage productions, and their resident artist, Richard Dadd, was an enthusiastic set designer. In 1818, Richard died of tuberculosis and was buried in the asylum cemetery. He had spent 42 years of his life in hospital. The art of Richard Dadd fell out of fashion for many years, but was rediscovered when the poet Siegfried Sassoon donated the Fairy Fellas masterstroke to the Tate Gallery in 1963. Sassoon, who had fought in the First World War with 3 of Dadd's great nephews, had received the painting as a wedding gift. In 1974, Freddie Mercury wrote a song called The Fairy Fellas Masterstroke for Queen's second album, firmly placing the painting into the realm of popular culture. So, tell us what you think about the painting, and does the story of the artist change your view of the work? And while you're here, please like and subscribe and listen to the podcast, and we hope to see you back very soon. Stay magical.